Rob Havers, it is so good to be with you in this event. We've known each other a long time. I can't think of anyone I respect more in the field. You're plying your trade nowadays in beautiful Chicago, Illinois at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. I imagine you have some good things going on up there, and I'll give you some time as we go through our talk today to tell us just what's on your agenda, but it's really good to have you here.
Thank you, Rob. It is a real pleasure to be talking with you today. And as you rightly said, we've known each other for a good number of years, and I've been a big admirer and supporter of everything you guys have done down there in New Orleans with the World War II Museum, really blazing a trail in terms of how history can be taught and brought to a wider public with the best academic information being disseminated in a very digestible and engaging fashion. So you guys are real market leaders. So a pleasure to be talking with you today.
Great, Rob. I thought today that a good use of our conversational time, and before we get to the Q&A, which will be later on in the program, that we talk about leadership, both in Operation Overlord. Of course, Saturday is the 76th anniversary of the D-Day landings. That's not a big anniversary. That's not 50, 75, 100. But here at the National World War II Museum, we're originally a D-Day museum, and we never miss an opportunity to call the events of June 6, 1944 to mind, and to kind of, as I kick them around, but kind of analyze them and maybe see if we can develop some new insights as we talk about that. So I thought maybe leadership, Rob. We've called this strategic and operational leadership in Overlord. Strategy, of course, is the art of setting broad goals and making sure that people beneath you have the resources to carry them out. Operations, the task of the warfighter. How exactly are we going to put this attack together? Where are the divisions? What's the logistics? What are the logistics going to be like? And so I thought we'd maybe look up and down the Allied chain of command. Maybe, who knows, even have a few things to say about the Soviets, and maybe a few things to say about the Germans as well. But maybe a good place to start. So let's just jump right in. How did we get to this point? How did we get to June 6, 1944? We got into the war. The British, of course, were in the war from September 1939. The United States, we sometimes refer to the home team, sorry about that. The United States, of course, December 7th, 1941. This is June of 1944. It's 4 years later. Why the long delay getting to Normandy, and how did we wind up with this military operation? I'll throw that one to you.
Thanks, Rob. And I think, looking back from the vantage point of nearly 76 years, it might seem as though it was preordained, that things rolled out in the fashion they did. But looking at the beginning of World War II from the British perspective, where will the decisive blow against Nazi-occupied Europe, where will that fall? And before the US enters the war, how is it that the British can deliver a blow that is of war-winning magnitude? When the US comes in, the US has been planning for a global conflagration, different considerations about a Japan first or a Germany first strategy, in the assumption that ultimately the US is going to be fighting both of those powers. Germany first obviously wins out, but you're right, an awful lot of time and effort has gone to the eve of Normandy. Soviet Union invaded in June of 1941, changes the dimension of the war. US comes in with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Constant refrain from popular opinion in the US, the Japanese started the attack against the US. Why isn't it Japan first? But massive logistical considerations. How do you land in Western Europe if Western Europe is your chosen destination? Secure the Atlantic. Convoys of troops, logistics need to be secured. The Battle of the Atlantic has to be won. Many considerations about a peripheral strategy. Winston Churchill, as you know, is in favor of that for a whole host of reasons, was in favor of that during World War I. So really, the essential thinking is, how do you mass enough men and equipment to deliver a decisive blow? Where should that decisive blow come, and at what juncture? And part 3 is in part informed by parts 1 and 2. The Dieppe landings in August of 42 probably indicate that anything less than an all-out assault is not going to be successful. The progressive whittling down of German combat potential on the Eastern Front also plays a big role. The Germans, by June of 1944, are terribly stretched on the Eastern Front. Their ability to respond quickly in the West is severely limited. Also dealing with the Allied invasion of Italy. So many different combinations are coming together at this point.
You know, you've brought something important up, I think, Rob, and I want our audience to know this, the Germany first strategy. So the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, but President Roosevelt wants to sell the country on a different way of fighting the war. Most people said we want revenge for Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt says Germany's the big threat. I'll pin you down right now. Do you think that was the correct decision?
I think absolutely it was the correct decision, and it speaks really to the challenges of leadership in wartime, because it's easy for us to say from a purely military perspective, we need to do X, Y, and Z. But for a man like FDR and for Winston Churchill, they're grappling with a multiplicity of competing demands. What's the post-war going to look like? And they have to think about that, even though it may well be well in the future. How does popular public opinion deal with the conduct of the war? This is apparent at all points during the conflict. The United States and the United Kingdom are democracies. These men and women in arms, in uniform, are there. So they're doing their duty. There's a great, and I'm paraphrasing, there's a great quotation about how men on the front line are keen to do their duty, but they're not necessarily keen to be heroes. And so how do you keep an entire nation, two nations, the Allied forces together on the home front and on the military front? And so this consideration is a constant one.
I'm just thinking of, you know, I've been a lecturer, a lecturer in university classes for many years. And I say, so we got in World War II, Germany first, we're going to march on Germany. And so naturally you invade Algeria. So I think that brings us to this peripheral strategy that the Allies worked out for several years before they thought they were ready to land directly in Western Europe. Tell us about Churchill and Roosevelt and the kind of battle sometimes going on between them about correct wartime strategy.
I think if we sort of take it geopolitically and you look at the map of the world and the globe, well, the shortest distance from the United Kingdom to Berlin, the heart of the Nazi empire, is across the Channel, Pas-de-Calais, straight east. Why would you divert attention and effort and resources anywhere else? Well, in some sense, that's absolutely true. But other considerations include, are your military up to the task? What are the other things you may be willing to head off? Churchill, certainly with his history and life steeped in imperial challenges, also has a notion that control of the Mediterranean is a British goal, for ensuring that the Mediterranean and links to the British Empire through the Suez Canal are maintained, are a constant consideration. And Churchill too, as you know, in World War I was very keen on the Dardanelles, the landings in Gallipoli, not meet the enemy with the main strength, a strategy to destabilize and weaken progressively rather than one cataclysmic clash. I think US thoughts about the best way to do it are tempered somewhat, and the opportunity to find out the actual caliber and experience fighting in Kasserine and North Africa is a useful lesson for all concerned.
In other words, would you say, or I'm paraphrasing, but tell me if I'm off base here, Churchill's fighting as World War II as much to keep India in the British Empire as he is to control the Mediterranean or necessary to beat the Germans in one climactic blow. He's looking at a post-war British Empire.
Yes, I think so, Rob. I think his natural instincts are conditioned by that imperial outlook. Yeah. He famously comments that he didn't become the king's first minister to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. This has to be in the back of his mind through much of World War II. But he also knows that the British strength is grounded in the empire, and that any diminution of that is going to have an impact on British combat potential, even if the manpower largely that the empire is able to bring to bear is mostly focused, it's somewhat focused in North Africa, but mostly focused against the Japanese.
How does Roosevelt feel about the British Empire? Rob, I feel I have to enter that into
Well, you know, you have a fundamental clash of political perspectives. FDR is at war to maintain democracy, to free enslaved peoples. The British Empire is the opposite of that in many ways. So fundamentally, there is this different consideration with both men. They have a shared enemy in the personage of Hitler and the Germans and the Japanese, but the means to that end are always going to be endlessly negotiable, I think. And you also, through the course of the war, see this shift in who is the major contributor to the alliance in terms of men, equipment, and who's actually doing the fighting. And it shifts dramatically through the war, and to the point where on the eve of Overlord, it is overwhelmingly the United States providing the weapons, providing the equipment, providing ultimately the largest contribution of manpower. And this is something very difficult for Churchill to deal with, I think. And the US, of course, is supplying substantially, as you know, Rob, the Red Army on the Eastern Front.
Right. What would you say Roosevelt's strengths as a strategist were? And then I'll probably circle back and ask you to discuss Churchill a bit too. Roosevelt has strengths as a strategist, and if there's some of them in your mind, tell us about where you think he could have used more strength or where he could have used some remediation. What are some problems?
I think FDR has a good sense of the art of the possible. He's willing to. He knows he has to manage the personality of Winston Churchill, and he has to play the cards he's dealt. I think Winston Churchill is probably he's a confident individual, and I think he overestimates potentially the ability of the British to be in the vanguard of this conflict. He knows that the post-war political settlement and situation requires as much British participation as possible. He's often looking for, and this in part informs his somewhat seemingly erratic decisions or thoughts about minor diversions of the Mediterranean. He's looking for an exclusively British area in which to stake the flag and advance British claims in the post-war world. So FDR, I think, has a good understanding of the big global position, which is you're fighting two adept enemies, either side of the world, different strengths, different weaknesses, but you have to prioritize. US thinking is Germany first, which is the bigger threat, also with the bigger ally on your side in the Soviet Union. And if the Soviet Union is knocked out of the war for whatever reason or makes a separate peace with the Germans, then it is a far more difficult conflict to win. So he's mindful, I think, of the political opportunities and challenges constantly, as well as the purely military and the economic considerations too.
How about Churchill, the arch anti-Bolshevik, the arch anti-communist throughout his career? And now he's on board. Now he's got Joseph Stalin on his team. How does he process that?
Well, it's a difficult consideration. You know, famously, Churchill sends British troops at the end of World War I as interventionist troops to support White Russians in the Russian Civil War. Famously is quoted as saying that he intended to strangle Bolshevism at birth, but he's also a pragmatist. He makes that famous comment that had Hitler invaded hell, I would at least have made a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. He is under no illusions as to the man Stalin is. In fact, when Churchill goes to Westminster College in 1946 to deliver what becomes known as the Iron Curtain Address, he does so in the sure and certain knowledge that the level of tyranny in Soviet Russia is on a similar scale to that of Nazi Germany. So he's under no illusions, but he's also a pragmatist. Yet simultaneously, as an imperialist, he knows that in the Mediterranean and on the borders of British India, the Russian Empire has always been a threat and a challenger to British primacy in the Eastern Mediterranean. So he's balancing all these considerations. He knows, though, as does FDR, that if the Russians drop out of the war through defeat, through separate peace, for whatever reason, then the chances of a British victory, an Allied victory, are markedly diminished.
Let me focus on Stalin for a moment. Right now we're talking about the great strategists, the three big political leaders of the big three. I guess it's the same question for Stalin. How does he process working with a bunch of arch capitalists? I mean, he's hooked up with the president of the United States, for heaven's sake. I grew up during the Cold War, and I remember that was the norm for me. I was born in 1958, so that was the norm. And I remember looking back at World War II, and it just seemed nearly impossible. Or hooking up with Winston Churchill. How does Stalin process this? He wake up every morning and say, well, they're sending me all the weapons I can use?
You know, that's a very good question, and what I would give Rob for, maybe I wouldn't, a moment inside the head of the deceased Joseph Stalin. How does he see all this? Well, he knows that his immediate challenge is Nazi Germany. Any ally from his perspective is a useful ally, and so he absolutely has to hook up with the British and the Americans, and to the extent that he is able to do what is necessary. But you referenced earlier, his constant refrain is the need for a second front, relieve pressure on the Red Army, relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, help with fighting Germany. So in the short to medium term, whatever it takes to survive for Joseph Stalin is foremost in his mind, I think. But he too has an eye on the post-war world. He knows that there will be a coming conflict, ideological conflict, if he survives World War II, and he's mindful of that as well. And he also looks to divide, where possible, the British and the Americans. In part, I think, speaking to FDR's idealism in a fashion that perhaps Churchill is less responsive to.
In the Cold War era, but even today, people occasionally say President Roosevelt was a bit naive about Stalin, referencing him as Uncle Joe. If Uncle Joe and I just sit around and talk this over like, two reasonable men, we can come to some kind of arrangement that will have our two peoples living in peace and friendship. Is that true, Rob, in your eyes? I know there's been a lot of research on it back and forth.
I think that Uncle Joe is a great propaganda title for a man like Joseph Stalin. To be referred to in that fashion in the Western media during World War II, he must have thought, well, this is wonderful. And you also have sort of indigenous left-wing parties in the United Kingdom, especially, less so perhaps in the United States, who have somewhat bought into this notion of
benevolence.
Exactly, and Stalin, I think, referred to some of these guys as useful idiots, especially members of the left who went to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, saw a whole host of essentially Potemkin villages, happy workers, come back and propagandize on part of Joseph Stalin. But is FDR naive? Possibly. Winston Churchill or the British go to war in September 1939. Churchill's not yet prime minister, in pursuit of a guarantee of Polish independence. That largely dissipates in the challenges and the discussions at Yalta and Potsdam. What is the alternative? In all honesty, is the United States going to prosecute a war against the Soviet Union in the aftermath of defeating Nazi Germany? Almost certainly not. I think there's a realpolitik here. You have to, it's the art of the possible in large part. And if anything, I would say, and this is speculative, that Churchill has a better sense as to, obviously, to the reality of the Soviet Union, but also in terms of what he thinks the ultimate goals of the Soviet Union are and Joseph Stalin are. Whatever we may think they are now, as opposed to the end of the war, it becomes very apparent that Soviet Union is at the end of its material means in 1945. Could it reach
the bottom of the manpower barrel, like every other country was at the time?
Exactly. So the formidable Red Army, and of course that's exactly what it is. Could it have prosecuted a war against the British and the Americans and the Canadians? We will never know. Would the British and Americans and Canadians have wanted to fight that conflict? So there are lots of different considerations here. Yeah, is FDR naive? Possibly a little bit. I think, he has to do, as I said, he has to, what can you achieve with what you've got? And of course, he's not around at the very end there.
To write his memoirs.
That's
Only
right.
Churchill. Stalin didn't write them, and Roosevelt didn't write them. Only Churchill wrote his memoirs, and they became extraordinarily influential as to how we see the events of World War II. He used to say, history will judge, he'd say to his aides and his ministers, history will judge you, and remember, I'm going to be one of the historians. And he knew he was living a book. He already had the book formulated in his mind while he was making these decisions.
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah, he famously says, history will be kind to me, for I intend to write that history. And funnily enough, history was terribly kind to him. And of course, I think Max Hastings once said that it is his volume's history of World War II is peerless prose, if occasionally poor history. So it's a great read, but also, as you know, Rob, and I'm sure our audience knows, Churchill has access to government papers far in advance of the 30-year rule in the United Kingdom. When he leaves office in July of 45, he takes an awful lot of government papers with him and draws on those to write those great volumes of his history of World War II. Documents and information that would not be available to your average historian until the 1970s. So he absolutely has a head start, and he absolutely is a peerless writer. There's no doubt about that.
No doubt about that. So we talked about the big political leaders. If you don't mind, let's start entering this operational zone. I think if there's one great American of the period of the Second World War, I think it might be George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. Tell us about Marshall's considerable skills, his considerable qualities. What did he bring to the table? How important was he to Allied victory in World War II, Rob?
I would absolutely agree, Rob. As you know, I spent a bit of time as president of the George C. Marshall Foundation on the post at the Virginia Military Institute in lovely Lexington, Virginia. Marshall, a graduate of VMI. And he really is, and I'm going to paraphrase from Marc Stoller's wonderful one-volume biography of Marshall, soldier statesman of the American century. Okay. Marshall brings to we'll say the table, a 40-odd years in uniform, in pre-World War I, World War I, where he develops magnificent reputation as a premier logistician, moving men and equipment in terms of battle, doesn't have a lot of combat experience, doesn't lead men in combat as many of the fighting generals of World War II do. But that, in combination with his time in the interwar years in China, in the Philippines, he brings to the table this breadth of experience as a statesman in some sense. He obviously goes on to become Secretary of State, the man for whom the Marshall Plan is named, but that the qualities he brings to that post-war consideration are nascent and apparent in World War II. So the man that gets everyone around the table, including Churchill, is a preeminent leader in every sense of what a leader should and could be. He brings people on board. He always has a plan. He's able to adjust when necessary. He is very minded to attack far earlier, as you know, Rob, into Europe, 42 or 43. He is persuaded otherwise, for a whole host of reasons, to delay the attack until originally May of 44 and then June of 44. But Marshall, as Chief of Staff of the Army, is a man who is both in command of the facts and with a great strategic sense as to what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, and what material needs to come on board to do that. So his skill as a logistician is employed in World War II on a far greater scale, and not just in terms of ammunition or tanks or fuel, but in terms of the individuals he brings on board to serve and keep key roles, but also in terms of political skill and his ability to manage up and manage down. Famously, he never He never allows the president to call him George and rebukes him. Rebuke's probably too strong a word. He famously asked the president to always refer to him as Marshal or General Marshal or General, and to eschew, if you like, that familiarity and that easy charm that FDR brought to every situation. And you spoke to a little bit about that with his comments about Uncle Joe and I did this and Uncle Joe and I did that. That masked a very sort of firm and steely manner, if you like. But Marshall was very cognizant of that, always took the opportunity to excuse himself where possible from events or situations where he thought the president's charm would be on full display and to which he himself, Marshall, would potentially be susceptible. So you've got this man who is devoid of ego, General Marshall, managing up and down a whole host of individuals with vast egos, which is, when I was at the Marsh Foundation, I often thought that Marshall is the absolute definition of cometh the hour, cometh the man. There could not have been, I don't think, a better chief of staff of the army than General George C. Marshall. And he steps up 1st of September 1939, the day that Germany invades Poland, and he's there till the bitter end, and then moves to become Secretary of State. So absolutely key figure in all of this.
How badly does Marshall wish to have the operational command of the Normandy landing?
Well, the sort of different bit of a debate on that. He is absolutely an ambitious individual. And if you look at the longevity he has in the United States Army, I don't think he gets his first star until the early 1930s. So he's already been in the Army nearly 30 odd years. And so keenly ambitious individual, famously says to FDR that my duty is to the country and to you as the commander-in-chief. Whomever you think appropriate to lead Overlord, Supreme Commander, it is your decision. And FDR responds that I could not sleep soundly at night, knowing that General Marshall was not in Washington at my side, so to speak, not literally, but in Washington. And he is absolutely the definition of service before self, I think.
That quote that I couldn't sleep at night if you weren't in Washington, that really does say something about George Marshall, the multifarious activities he took on. I guess sort of, besides Chief of Staff of the Army, kind of chief cook and bottle washer. If there was a problem that arose, Roosevelt expected Marshall to fix it or to find the men who would fix it. And so Roosevelt can sleep better at night knowing Marshall's there, quite literally, because Marshall more or less is handling these problems.
Yes, absolutely. And if you look at the sort of range of activities he undertakes, he's frequently touring the country. To the extent that the war needs to be sold, he is selling the war effort. He is persuading business leaders to refocus their endeavors, refocus their activities, produce weapons for the United States Army, focus production towards a national goal, the winning of World War II. You also see this in great measure too, when as Secretary of State, he goes out and sells the Marshall Plan to the American people, which is astonishing work of salesmanship, essentially, because he's asking men and women in the United States to essentially financially support enemies who their sons, husbands had been fighting comparatively recently. And Marshall does it because he can convey the sense that he can convey an authority, I think, that speaks to the fact that this is good for the country, and an individual like Marshall, whose personal life and conduct was beyond reproach, is convincing in doing just that. It's a wonderful story. The man, the architect of victory, but not actually commanding the troops. But that, of course, leads us a little bit further down the operational plane now, the operational level, to Eisenhower. And perhaps if we're going to be discussing General Eisenhower, we might want to put in a few words about General Montgomery. I've been a university professor since 1984, so I've been teaching U.S. undergraduates for over 30 years. And every single one of them hates Montgomery. I mean, they don't know much about World War II before they hit your class, but they sure know that General Montgomery was obnoxious. It's become a kind of American trope. So I would first ask you to talk a bit about Eisenhower, what he brought to the table, what his strengths were,
how surprised people were when he got the job of Supreme Commander. Hardly a household name. And then maybe about some of that rivalry or some of that interplay with Montgomery when the two of them were actually in the field.
Yeah, I mean, Marshall is a big Eisenhower fan and a big supporter, and healthily endorses Ike to FDR as the commander of Overlord. He'd seen Eisenhower in action as a junior officer and was one of many, sometimes known as Marshall's men, that Marshall allegedly kept a little black book on who would be the future commanders in any conflict, or who should be higher up the chain in whatever happens, World War II or even post. The Marshall Foundation thought at one point briefly we'd discovered this black book in the archives of the foundation. It had a long list of comparatively junior officers, majors and lieutenant colonels, with sort of comments next to their names. Turns out it was planning for a party that Marshall had undertaken, and so sadly this key document for the writing of the history of World War II was not there after all. I'm not sure it actually does exist.
Why people hate historians. See why people hate historians. You got a great story, you got a little black book, and now
yeah, with my president's hat on, I thought, well, could we sell it to the media, perhaps briefly, gentlemen, before we come back and say that's actually not the case, but it's not the case. So Eisenhower's an impressive individual. Again, able to balance the needs of the diplomatic needs of that role. I mean, he has to deal with the enemy, obviously fighting the enemy, and also has to deal with allies. Winston Churchill again once said the worst thing, the only thing worse than fighting a war without allies is actually fighting with them. And it's sort of interesting to note that Marshall in World War I spends a lot of time as a liaison with the French military, gets an understanding of how other countries and cultures engage in war, and Eisenhower, dealing with the British, little closer than the Americans and the French possibly, but it is very adept at that as well. And it's interesting, you note Montgomery, an abrasive individual, and it is to the credit, I suppose, of men like Marshall and Eisenhower that they can see the skills of a Montgomery, and probably to a certain extent a Patton as well. And are able to employ them in a fashion that makes best use of their strengths while largely mitigating their weaknesses, I think. And if you look at key leaders in key conflicts throughout history, the best are able to bring the best to the table and allow them as much latitude as possible to play to those strengths without allowing their weaknesses to sort of unbalance the equation there. But that's a real skill in itself.
Absolutely. The quote I always remember from Montgomery is, "My entire art of war consists of an infinite capacity for taking pains." In other words, lining up every last detail. Now, when you realize that he's playing with the last field army that the British are going to be able to have in World War II, that there's no real replacements, that's all dried up. Britain has been in the war a long time, a lot longer than the United States. So I've always been willing to cut Montgomery some slack, and I know that will generate commentary online, because every time I've said that in front of a class, I got a lot of pushback.
Well, and you're absolutely right. And when you think about the conduct of military operations, casualties are inevitable, but the British towards the end of World War II are absolutely cognizant of the fact that they are at the absolute end of their manpower strength. Casualty conservation becomes a key consideration in those last months of the war. Everyone, as you rightly said about the Red Army, is at the end of their logistical chain, literally. If
I were to pin you down one more time, I know we're supposed to be objective as historians, and we try, but every now and then we have favorites. Let's throw Marshall out of the equation for a moment, because I think he would be the obvious answer for you. But if it wasn't Marshall, who do you think the best leader on the Allied side was? And feel free to throw in anybody, throw in the Soviets if you want, but I just wonder if you have a favorite.
Well, so thinking about this, Rob, many years ago, when I was still in the classroom, I wrote a very slim volume about the fighting for Cherbourg as part of a broader series that my colleagues at the War Studies Department at Sandhurst put together, and it looked at each individual piece of the Normandy landings, each beach, airborne, breakout, all the rest of it. And I had the volume on Cherbourg, and I was particularly impressed with J. Lawton Collins, Lightning Joe Collins, one of the, I think, youngest corps commanders in the United States Army. I forget his age, but in his 40s, an individual goes on to become Chief of Staff of the Army, not exactly a household name in the modern world, but a man who fights the Japanese, fights the Germans, and is involved in the early days of the Cold War in Korea, Chief of Staff of the Army. So just sort of a very interesting individual and very thoughtful leader who has a challenge on his hands to cut the Cotentin Peninsula, another sort of part of the Overlord operation, essentially capture a deep water port, absolutely vital for logistical support. They eventually do cut the Cotentin, see Cherbourg massively damaged, as you know, so isn't quite the win that they thought, but fascinating character.
The United States Army was very fortunate in its corps commanders. I think if you look up and down in the fight in Europe, but also the fight in the Pacific as well, that's where you really, I think, where the U.S. Army tucked in its hard chargers. Army commanders tended to be more about administration and logistics, but the hard chargers tended to be the corps commanders, and I always thought the United States Army was very well served. You mentioned Collins, there's a number of other names we could probably toss into that hat.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right there, and that again is something that popular mind maybe not as familiar with. Certainly more opportunity for greater discussion there.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take some pot shots at Adolf. I never like to have one of these conversations without taking a pot shot or two at Hitler. What about German leadership in the Normandy campaign? What can you say about it? How would you characterize it?
Well, it's in some sense indecisive. I think that the Germans are well confused by Operation Fortitude and the feint towards Pas-de-Calais. The famous incident of nobody being willing to wake Adolf Hitler up to commit panzers on to drive against the beaches, famous sort of encapsulation of some of this indecisiveness. Simultaneously, of course, the Germans are battling the Red Army, Operation Bagration. All eyes are on the Eastern Front in many ways, which is a massive undertaking for the Red Army. End of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. I think the German High Command is unaware of exactly how precarious the situation was for the Allies in Normandy. Easy for us to sit back and say a little more decisive action might have paid dividends, but
just because I've spent my whole life reading the documents from the German side, they talk about the Allies very little. They talk about their own hopelessness, the hopelessness of their own position all the time. And it's funny, we think of Omaha Beach. They don't look all that hopeless on Omaha Beach, do they? They're laying down the fire. But if you read any one of the memoirs of the German generals after World War II, which are often filled with special pleading, you just get a sense that they thought the situation in Normandy by that point was hopeless. 65 divisions, about a third of them were static divisions. They didn't even have any transport, so they were plunked down on a stretch of beach and made to stay there until they died. I don't know if Rommel, he was home delivering a pair of shoes to his wife. If he'd been present, could there have been a more rapid response? A German Panzer Division did counterattack the day of the landing, got to the sea, just like it was supposed to. And it was now in between the British and the Canadians. And what was it supposed to do there? It certainly couldn't hold the position. That's, Rob, that's what we call another webinar. It's a German leadership in Normandy.
No, that's right. Yes, indeed.
Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to go over to question and answer because we have some good questions in the Q&A. Tell us about the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. What is its mission? What are you guys into now? What are your big projects? What's going on up north?
Well, thank you, Rob. That's a great entree. Pritzker Military Museum and Library has been in Chicago since 2003, founded originally as a library and grounded in the personal interest and personal collections of Colonel Jennifer Pritzker. served a career in the United States Army, retired as a lieutenant colonel, honorary colonel in the Illinois National Guard, became a museum and moved to a new site right downtown on Michigan Avenue, 104 South Michigan, 3 floors there. And our mission is essentially to curate and collect and provide programs in support of the idea of the citizen soldier, which is quite a US-centric idea, essentially looking at all conflicts from the Revolutionary War to the contemporary world, war on terror, I suppose, all branches, and really looking at the experiences of the men and women who don the uniform, sometimes for long periods as a career in the military, other times less so, soldiers or who responded to the call, whether the Revolutionary War or in World War II, and at the end of those conflicts took off the uniform and returned to civilian life. So you've been a participant in our different programs, broadcasts from our wonderful TV studios in Chicago, author talks, symposia, exhibitions and expositions of this idea of the citizen soldier, and also really in part motivated by a belief that in a country like the United States that spends an awful lot of money on defense, if the civilian populace is not well educated as to the need for a strong military and how the military does what it does, and also who the military are, the men and women who serve, their motivations while they serve and post-serving, that is not a good exercise of democracy or civilian oversight of the military. Right. Civilian oversight of the military, as Klaus had said, is absolutely paramount. So we try and do all these considerations. We have been, like you have, been working remotely since the pandemic. We had a new series called Pritzker Military Presents On the Home Front. A lot of interviews, a lot of discussions. You were kind enough to do one with us a couple of months ago now, Rob. Really trying to maintain interest in military history, underscore the fact that the military is a utility and a resource for the country. You see deployment of National Guard troops on the streets today in a fashion that none of us could have imagined. The National Guard does this habitually, but understanding the role of the military in this current upheaval is vital, of course, because they are there as an aid to civilian power. And so that sort of exposition of the role of the military, appropriate role of the military, and also raising the veil on who it is who serves. Less than 1% of the United States population serves in the military today. That provides potentially a big demographic gulf in terms of understanding on the civilian side who the military are and what they do and what their motivations are. So we like to think we fill that a little bit. And of course, military history is our bread and butter. And we have a broad canvas, as I said, all branches, all conflicts that the United States has been involved in, and not just the United States.
I did a book event at the Pritzker back in 2004, 2005, can't remember. I had just had a book out, and people still contact me about that. I think it was sent out as a podcast or it's online. And I looked at it the other day, and I just want everyone out there to know I had a lot more hair at that time. So,
well, the wonderful and not so wonderful consideration of all these virtual programs is that they stay extant, if you like, in perpetuity. So you will always be a young man in some ways at the Pritzker, Rob. And to your point about what are we doing currently, we have a wonderful exhibition called The Allied Road to Victory that is a combination of some of the oral history testimony, the transcripts of that, of many of our veterans that we have in our oral history collection, three-dimensional artifacts, and really traces the last months of the war in Europe and in Japan, collapse of Nazi Germany, German surrender, and then the dropping of the atomic bomb, surrender of Japan, liberation of the concentration camps. And next year we will also have sort of a signature exhibition centered on our collection of Malden cartoons. The great cartoonist Bill Malden, who was a wonderful who brought to life, if you like, the experience of the American infantrymen in World War II, then had a tremendous post-war career in St. Louis and Chicago, documenting through incredibly skillful cartoons the turmoil and otherwise of the sort of last 50 years of the 20th century. So we'll have an exhibition based on that, putting a book out as well, and also a documentary. So more to come on that.
Fantastic. I think we have about 10 to 15 minutes left in our time together. And I've got a pile of questions, and we'll do our best to get through as many of them as possible. How's that, Rob? So
that sounds good.
I'll give you these as quick hits, and you return them to me. I'll serve them to you, and you return the service.
I'll do my best, Rob.
Jim Cowart, it would be truly shocking if a Brit, I believe referring to you, failed to agree that Germany first was the right decision. But wouldn't an Aussie say the strategy should at least be equal effort between Japan and Germany? It's a good question.
Yeah, yes, I think an Australian absolutely would. And as you know, or as I'm sure our audience knows, the oral support of the idea of this fortress at Singapore and the guardianship, if you like, that it offers to Australia and New Zealand is substantial. The British talk this up throughout the interwar years. Winston Churchill, especially so. The Australians send troops to North Africa in the belief that the British are firmly committed to that notional fortress at Singapore. As we all know, it was far from an actual fortress. But I think absolutely it has to be Germany first. Once the Japanese threat to Australia has largely evaporated, then I think it makes even more sense. Had the Japanese made further progress further south, landed in
with the coral
exactly, that's right. Then, you know, who can say? But as always, it's for a leader, it's always a constant balance between what you need to promise for a whole host of reasons and what you can actually deliver on. And you hope that the two are in constant step. That was not always the case for any leader in World War II. Promises to Australia and New Zealand about Singapore and elsewhere, you know, defense of Malaya. Yeah, very sharp relief as to them not being in firm step, I think.
Okay, good one for you here, Rob. This is from Terry on Facebook. Monday morning quarterbacking, which is, of course, the only kind of quarterbacking we love as historians. How would the Overlord campaign have been different if Patton would have been in Bradley's position?
That is a very good question. A very good question. The first president of the George C. Marshall Foundation, of which I had the very fortuitous to be president of, was General Bradley, and a tremendous individual and a tremendous leader. How would things have been different? You know, I'm not exactly sure. A lot more, perhaps, decisive, unsupported action, perhaps.
You're not painting it in pretty colors necessarily.
You know, it's difficult. I mean, what can we take away? We know that Patton is a hard charger, willing to take risks, willing to go against orders from above. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, fill in the blanks there a bit, Rob, I think.
Here's kind of on the same topic. This is Tom Moriarty from our Q&A. Coalition warfare is perhaps the most difficult form of all warfare. True enough. Was Eisenhower's superpower his ability to hold the Allied coalition together given all the stresses and some of the difficult personalities of the politicians and senior generals involved? But here's the capper. Was there any other U.S. commander who could have done it as well as Eisenhower?
That is a very good question, too. Is that his superpower? You know, I would say in large part, yes. I think he does a tremendously good job of managing difficult personalities. And I think he's somewhat aided deliberately by the good integration of senior British leaders at all junctures of SHAEF command, if you like. That's a good question. Who else? I don't know, in all honesty. I'm not sure. If we were sitting down today, as we are, I guess, 76 years since Overlord, and drew up a long list of key prerequisites for that Overlord commander, you would essentially draw up the Eisenhower's resume and personal characteristics. Now, is that impacted by the fact that he was in command and things did go according to plan? Almost certainly, yes. Could somebody else have done things with the same result but differently? possibly.
How about Douglas MacArthur?
Yeah, probably not. I don't think. Probably not.
George Marshall, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about Marshall's ambition to be the Overlord commander, and I think I would have to give that a great deal more thought. Possibly Marshall. He certainly possessed many of those prerequisite skills. Yeah.
Okay, Mike MC. It could be a hip hop designation. Rob, I believe it's you he's talking to, thankfully. Rob, what was the biggest mistake the Allies made during Operation Overlord? This is a good question.
Oh, biggest mistake? Interesting. Well, given that it largely goes according, I mean, there is. I think it's Bradley that talks about knowing that the challenges of landing on Omaha at the time they land and where they land and all the rest of it is going to produce heavy casualties. I think if they had another opportunity for things to go better there, it would have been that. I'm not sure that's a mistake. I mean, they recover very well, but
I might toss into the mix the bombardment plan at Omaha Beach. The decision to go in at half light. You just had a kind of a half-hour single flyover for some aircraft, hardly the greatest show on earth. I mean, I'm no expert on the tactical bombardment plan that morning, but that's one you hear a number of historians swim in those waters and talk about that. No military operation is perfect, and they all get people killed, and they all get people killed needlessly. Even if they win, you could parse it at the end and say, "Oh, we could have done that more cheaply or with less loss of friendly life." That's just the nature of the beast.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. This terrible cliche, but hindsight is 2020. Given the result, I guess the big question is, could it have been done more cheaply with less lives lost? Probably. I'm not sure where exactly, because for every piece of tinkering in one area, there'll be a reaction elsewhere. So,
sure. Boy, the good questions just keep coming. Here's a basic one. What is the name of the good biography of Marshall that Mr. Habers mentioned?
Oh, it is. There are quite a few good biographies of Marshall. The famous one is the 4-volume by Forrest Pogue, the sort of official biography. But the best single volume by Marc Stoller, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Vermont, is George C. Marshall's Soldier Statesman of the American Century. Written in 1989, I think, so 30 years old or so, but still tremendous. Just a great exploration of Marshall the man. The subtitle is Soldier Statesman, and it just looks at where Marshall came from and how he became the man that steps up as Chief of Staff in September of '39, and also how he becomes the man that steps up as Chief of Staff, as a Secretary of State under Harry Truman at the dawn of the Cold War. So a great book, thoroughly endorsed and recommended.
Great. Let's see. Patton, because Patton is a source of endless fascination, and this is W. Vita. Patton was Bradley's boss in North Africa, but he was subordinate to Bradley in France. How did that shift affect their relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not really sure on that one, Rob. I guess it's the classic, if at some point in life you are in authority over another individual and then the situation is switched, depending on who you are, you either take it on the chin and are terribly respectful and responsive, or probably in the case of Patton and Bradley, the opposite. You take greater liberties, you are more inclined to push your boundaries. And I think with a man like Patton, that's probably the case.
Specific question from Bob S. How close did Bradley get to actually withdrawing from Omaha Beach? This is a good one because it's in every single book written on the Omaha Beach landing. But lately, there's been people talk about it in different ways. Any thoughts, Rob?
You know, I'm not exactly sure, Rob. Certainly a consideration. I think there's that famous moment in Longest Day. Admittedly, that was made quite a while ago. I'm not exactly sure.
If you think about it, how often we come back to quoting The Longest Day.
Yeah, you know,
an extraordinarily influential movie.
It certainly is. It certainly is for a whole host of reasons.
Let's see here. I think, let me just get one more, Rob, okay? Let's see. Carol Townsend, remind us again of how many soldiers were involved in D-Day landings and how many lost their lives that day. Do we have a ballpark figure on that, Rob?
I think at the end of the day, it's 5 beaches and however many divisions. It's around about 175,000, I think.
Right.
And I think casualties, good question. I think casualties alone on Omaha are in just under 5,000 killed, another 10,000 wounded. I'd have, like many people, I have to Google the precise figures, but I think 175 land across, you know, British, Canadian, Free French, and American.
I can't tell you how many people are asking, who, if it wasn't Eisenhower, who would you have replaced him with? That's a question that is obviously of great interest. And I think, you know, it shows in my eyes, Rob, Eisenhower still has the reputation of kind of a chairman of the board type, managing that coalition. But we Americans, at least, we like those hard chargers. Nobody ever called him Lightning Dwight, you know, like they call Lightning Joe Collins for obvious reasons. And I write military history, and so do you, and you know that readers respond to that as well. You say he was a magnificent chairman of the board. Their eyes glaze over a bit. I think underplaying the true importance of being a chairman of the board in modern coalition warfare. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. And there is a cultural gravity about this kind of thing. And maybe it's a human gravity that we are drawn to those kind of leaders who say, okay, lads, follow me, over the top and off we go.
Yeah.
The reality is that the big muscle movements, successful muscle movements that occur, unless they are undertaken under the sort of the likes of a chairman of the board, they are far less likely to be successful. That's kind of the sort of definition of strategic thinking. You have to link together the whole panoply of actions towards a greater whole, or otherwise each individually can fail. And so they may not be as dramatic, as exciting being chairman of the board, but you only know how effective they are when you have an ineffective chairman of the board, and you see the result. Because without that sort of leadership at that level, all the more tactical and operational successes are irrelevant.
Rob, I think I'm going to let you off the hook now. I think we're done, but I'm going to answer one question on your behalf from Greg Neely. Please repeat the name of the museum institution that was discussed regarding all U.S. wars. That would be the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, and you're talking to Rob Havers, the president and CEO of that magnificent institution. So stay healthy up there, Rob, in Chicago. Come visit us.
Will do, Rob, and you guys down there too. Look forward to coming down to seeing you and having you come and visit us in Chicago. And if your viewers are watching, at some point we will be open. We have a great virtual exhibition or virtual iteration of our current Allied Road to Victory exhibition. So pritzkermilitary.org is our website. See us virtually and in person soon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone. Great questions. If I'd had you as students, I never would have left academia. That's not true. I love working at the museum, but you asked some great questions today. There's a lot more too. So,
yeah, very good.
All right, I think we're going to sign off. Rob Citino here, and Rob Havers, my friend, signing off from Chicago and New Orleans, Louisiana.